Welcome back. This morning we learned that the British broadcaster Sir David Frost died of a heart attack last night. He was 74. Frost was legendary for his interviews of everyone from the Beatles to Tony Blair. But it was his interrogation of Richard Nixon that he'll be most remembered for. Earlier today, I asked CNN's Piers Morgan for his reflections. Piers Morgan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Ryan.
This morning, when you learned of David Frost's death, you said on Twitter that he was a hero of yours. Tell us why he was a hero.
I think for anybody in the world of television interviewing, he was the peerless interviewer. Sir David was somebody who, for the last 4 or 5 decades, had interviewed, I think, every living British Prime Minister, every living American president, almost every world leader, and, of course, famously, the great interview with Richard Nixon, in which he got him to finally apologize to the American people. And I think that for anyone in the world of journalism and television journalism, Sir David was the best.
That Nixon interview is the one, of course, that's most famous to American viewers. But are there other interviews that stand out to you that maybe American viewers didn't see or can now look up on YouTube that also showed off his skills?
There are some you can't look up on YouTube. There was a famous one with Rupert Murdoch in which it's reputed that it was so confrontational. I think it was in the late 60s, early 70s, that Rupert Murdoch made sure it could never get re-aired and didn't speak to David Frost for the next 30 years. So I don't know if that's all completely true, but that was certainly the rumor. He was a very ruthless interviewer in his early years. He did some memorable interviews with a lot of people, but I come back to the Nixon interview because I'm not sure how much people realized just how much David Frost invested in that personally. He couldn't sell it to the American networks because it was deemed checkbook journalism, because he was paying Richard Nixon for that interview. So he actually raised, he told me, over $2 million, this is back in the 70s, to go and sell it virtually station by station around America, getting his own sponsors in each individual state and territory. And in the end, he was able to pay Nixon himself, I think, got $600,000. David Frost made a small fortune himself, and the rest is history. But, that was a real piece of bold, risk-taking, innovative journalism and television broadcasting, the like of which I don't think anyone has ever done before or since.
And from it, we remember that famous line from Nixon, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And after that point, David Frost just tries to have Nixon keep talking, to say more and more about that. To me, that's a lesson that can be learned from David Frost, to get your guests to keep talking. Are there other lessons that you've taken away from his career?
Yeah, I used to see David quite regularly, and we'd have lunch, and he was actually the last Brit interviewer who did shows on both sides of the Atlantic, and we used to laugh because when he did it back in the 70s, he used to use Concorde to commute, and now 40 years later it takes twice as long to get from London to New York. So he certainly got the better of that situation. But he was somebody that said to me, look, there are 2 things you really have to focus on as a television interviewer as compared to a print interviewer. One is exercising the power of silence. And he said, you really have to know when to shut up and let somebody, your guest, fill the gap. Because particularly with somebody like Nixon, who's so intelligent and so combative, it was the silences in that interview which teased out a lot of the confessional material from Nixon. He also said that you could never over-research for an interview. And you look again at Nixon, he did 28 hours of tape with Richard Nixon. And the amount of preparation that David Frost had to do, he told me it was weeks and weeks and weeks of really immaculate preparation. And what that meant was that he was then able to go anywhere that Nixon went and know where he was going, second-guess him, and in many cases be ahead of him. And that was an incredibly powerful tool in the David Frost armory. So, you look at the Nixon interview, and it has to be the template, not just for David Frost's interview style, but for anyone following him, is that you could never do enough preparation. I think he had a beguiling charm. I always called him the charming assassin because he would be so seductively friendly and nice and polite, and then he would ask the most brutal questions with this lovely smile on his face and get out the most extraordinary revelations. And that was David Frost. He was the quintessential British gentleman, and he used all that. He was a kind of James Bond of interviewers, if you like, where before you knew it, he dumbed you down.
A lot we can learn from him. Piers Morgan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian.